Okay, I have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening. I'm Stan Banish, a board member of the Norwood Park Historical Society, and I have the privilege of introducing Durkin Keating, who is the Dr. C. Frederick Kennegees, I believe is how you pronounce it, professor of history at North Central College in Naperville. I might point out that the college is adjacent to the former site of Fort Payne during the Black Hawk War. So our speaker teaches history amid history. Dr. Keating holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Illinois and a Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from the University of Chicago. Perhaps her most important contribution to scholarship was as co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Chicago. I'll hold this up, okay? This is it. So this is not bedtime reading, okay? But nevertheless, it's loaded with history about our area right here in Chicago. Okay? And another one of her books is Rising Up from Indian Country, about the Battle of Fort Dearborn and other related Native American issues. And that's this book here, okay? Now this one it's a little smaller, so you can take it to bed with you, and over about a month or two, you'll probably finish it. But tonight you will hear about Juliette Kinzie, one of Chicago's forgotten female founders, an important person in the city's early history and her world before the Great Chicago Fire. So I now present Dr. Keating.
Thanks very much. Am I going to be okay? Yeah, we're good. Yeah, I can hear myself then. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for the lovely invitation, and to Art for setting all of this up. I really appreciate being here. And my congratulations to you on the book. This is a huge deal, and it's very exciting to be here the first couple of days after it's out. I've got my copy, and I'm looking forward to going home and poring over it for my bedtime reading then. So we're there as well. So I'm going to talk today about this lady, Juliette Kinzie, and she's somebody that I spent a lot of time with from, I think it was probably from 2012 to when the book was published in 2019. So, and then since then, she's still there a lot. One of, I don't know, do you guys, maybe you have this feeling too. There are people in history that you're like, gee, I'd really like to sit down and talk to them. I think I'd like this person, and I think I'd be interested in getting to know them, taking a walk, having a cup of coffee. I'm not sure about Juliette. She's a tough lady, a really interesting person, but she's also someone that I disagreed with a lot of the things that she did, but I found her really interesting. So she kept my interest. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I saw. So how did I get interested in her? As Stan said, I wrote this book about the Battle of 1812, and it turns out that Juliette Kinzie wrote one of the first and most important accounts of that in a book called Walbun, and I'm going to show you, just published in 1856. That book has remained in press, so in print. So it's been at least 11 editions. There's a beautiful Lakeside Press edition that was done in the early part of the 20th century, so a little over 100 years ago. That's just, it's a beautiful book. And so I found that and was just really enjoyed using that in the Battle of 1812, Battle of Fort Dearborn book on 1812. And then after I was done with that project, I have a friend who's like, well, you know, there's all kinds of letters. She wrote lots and lots of letters. So I don't know whether I would consider, yeah, no, she's a friend still, but she got me going on this. She goes, look at the letters. They're on microfilm at the Chicago History Museum. So I can remember in 2013 in January of 2013, going into the archive at the Chicago History Museum, and they had a microfilm of 700 or 800 letters that Juliette had written between a couple earlier on in the 1830s, 1840s. Most of them are in the 1850s and 1860s. They're to all kinds of people, but they're mostly to her daughter. And I just really found them fascinating as a way of getting insight into what Chicago was like, particularly in the 1850s and 1860s, and then piecing together her whole story. So that's where the basis here was, finding this cache of letters, which you don't usually run into because we don't have that kind of collection of letters for everyday people very often. They don't land in archives. And even more unusual is to find 19th century women. So there just aren't that many out there. These letters are held the University of North Carolina. They have a family history collection, and at the Georgia Historical Society. So we just have microfilm copies here in Chicago. So I couldn't resist. And that's how I got started on this project. So this is an image of her that was is a painting by a very famous portrait painter of the 19th century, George P.A. Healy. You probably would recognize as Abraham Lincoln or as Grant or Sherman. I love his Sherman. He did a lot of prominent, if you go to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, you'll see lots of his portraits. He also did portraits of many families in Chicago in the 1850s and in the 1860s. He cycles through and he spends a couple of years here, and then he goes to another city and does these portraits. So he's one of the most famous portrait painters. And she had her portrait done, and it kind of gives you a sense of who she is. She's looking very much, to my mind, with the lace and the pin is Julie, and she's got a lace mantilla on, but she's got very much an Easterner's clothing, right? So she's bringing the East out to Chicago, and yet in the foreground here is an Indian blanket. And so she wants the touchstone to be for people to look at her and say, oh, she's very cultured. She has on all the trappings of an East Coast cultured woman, but she's also someone who's pointing you to the direction that she also adopted. She adopted the West as her home place. And so she's born in 1806 in Middleton, Connecticut. She's going to move to Chicago to the Midwest in 1830. She moves first to Wisconsin, and then she's going to come to Chicago in 1833. She will be here until her death in 1870. So her life spans, and another interesting thing for me was she spans roughly the same time as Abraham Lincoln. And so she's a little bit older than Mary Lincoln, but Mary Lincoln's life is always in my mind as I'm going along here, thinking about other women and men and women and how they're negotiating these years. So her life spans before the War of 1812 through the end of the Civil War. And there are big momentous changes that take place. So she starts out as an Easterner, she becomes a Westerner, and by the end of her life, so by the time of the Civil War, her daughter, whom she sends all those letters to, has married a Southerner in Savannah, Georgia, and her son-in-law describes her as a Northerner. So she's an Easterner, a Westerner, and then she's a Northerner. So you get some sense of the storyline that we've got with her. Okay. So she starts in Middleton, Connecticut in 1806, as I said. She's born into a really wealthy, prominent family. Her father is a banker. He's going to go bankrupt in 1819, but there's money early on. Her Grandfather is a Wolcott. The Wolcott family is big in politics in Connecticut. They're also Episcopals, and they're Episcopals in a state that had, the state religion was Congregationalism up until 1816, 1817. So they're the dissenters from the state religion, which into the teens in Connecticut is that. So she grows up in an interesting household. She spends a lot of time in her grandfather's study. She gets a good, solid education from her mother and from her family, but she's also very engaged with the West right from the start. So she lives in Middleton, Connecticut, but her story, she gets connected to Chicago. She's 11 or 12 when her uncle, her mother's brother, Alexander Wolcott, comes out here as the physician, the army surgeon for Fort Dearborn. No, oh my God, I've got it wrong. He's a physician, but he's coming out as the U.S. Indian agent to Chicago. So he's the U.S. Indian agent at Chicago, 1817, 1818, 1819. And Wolcott then writes home letters to his sister. So he's writing between Chicago and Middletown. They're going back and forth. And Juliette, as an 11 and 12-year-old, starts to write the return letters. So her mother is busy with her household and her husband going bankrupt, but her daughter then is writing these letters back and forth. And Juliette becomes completely enamored with Chicago. She wants to go to Chicago, particularly as things are falling apart in her home. Not her family, but the fortunes of the family have really taken a nosedive. Her dad is going to be jailed in New Haven, Connecticut for his debts. And the family's going to kind of flee around kind of in front of debtors. They're going to move up the Hudson River, and then they're going to finally move over to upstate New York. And that's where they'll land for a period of time. All of this time then Juliette's thinking, I'd like to go west. I'd like to be with my uncle in Chicago. And one of the things that she's able to read is this, if you're interested in this area in the 1820s, Henry Schoolcraft's book, A Narrative Journal of Travels, he's out with an expedition that Lewis Cass heads. Lewis Cass will be a perennial presidential candidate in the 1840s and 1850s. He's going to be a Democrat in the Jackson administration. But here in 1820, he's out running this. They're up the Mississippi River and looking at the Western Great Lakes. Henry Schoolcraft draws the scenes that he is encountering. He's writing about what the world is like. She reads this. She's very taken with this. Her book that she's going to be writing, Waban, I think is very much modeled on this. She sees this as a model for what she can do when she's going to go west and get a chance to do that. The other thing about Juliette one of the other things about Juliette that's really interesting is she's really well educated. So she gets a really good education at home, but then her uncle, I guess there's really no one else that would know more about this at this point than I do. Her uncle probably pays for her to go to Emma Willard's Academy, which is one of the few schools where young women could go to get an education. It wasn't a college. Emma Willard's is now, it remains an academy down to the present through, I think it's K through 12. So it's a boarding school, day school in outside of Albany, New York. It was still further south on the Hudson River when Juliette goes. But Juliette gets to go because, again, pretty clear her uncle stepped in and helped pay for it. Because her uncle's boss is Lewis Cass, the guy who was running that expedition a couple of years before, and he sends his daughters to this school. So Juliette gets to go to this school, and she studies with a woman by the name of Emma Willard. And Emma Willard is a really interesting woman. She founds this school. She's also one of the very first historians of the United States. So she's one of the first people that writes a history of the United States. We don't think much about it, but it's a wonderful book. She does a lot of geography. There's a lot of illustrations. She wants people to learn about history with maps And it's another thing that Juliette will do when she gets out to Chicago. She's going to draw maps. She's going to draw. These are all things that she's learned how to do. So she's in the 1820s. She's doing this work. In the meantime, her uncle has married into a very prominent Chicago family, the Kinzie family. So the U.S. agent has married one of the Kinzie daughters, Ellen Kinzie. And so Alexander Wolcott's they go back and forth. So Juliette has met her uncle's wife, and Juliette wants to come out to Chicago to meet them. And in the meantime, Ellen Kinzie's brother, John Harris Kinzie, who prominent in the book here at the beginning of your book on Norwood Park, picture of him there, is John Kinzie, comes east with a group of indigenous people, with Ho-Chunk leaders in 1829, and in 1830 they marry. So we don't have much in terms of letters about what a wonderful romance this was, but what we know is Juliette was in love with the West, and marrying John Kinzie got her west. So she marries John Kinzie in 1830. They have a very long, John Kinzie will die in 1865. They have a very long marriage in the years between 1830 and 1835, a marriage that is really of equals in many ways, which again, the comparisons that we can think about with Mary and Abraham Lincoln are interesting ones. Okay, so where does she go? So John Kinzie is located at Portage up in Wisconsin. So he's at what's called Fort Winnebago. And so Portage, he's going to be the Indian agent to the Ho-Chunk at Portage, and they come west. They're going to go through the Erie Canal, across the lakes, and they're going to come into Portage. And so they're going to be in Portage in the first years of her time in the West. And it's very much Indian country. It's Ho-Chunk territory. And the U.S. Indian agent, whether it was Alexander Wolcott at Chicago or her husband now, John Kinzie, at Portage, they're really the ambassador to the Indian nation from the United States. So they have a really important job. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Fort Winnebago, did you say?
Yeah, so Fort Winnebago is it's in Portage today. So it's right there. So they're not adjacent to each other, but they're very close to each other. And so if you go to Portage today, you can see this house, which is the U.S. agent's house that the colonial dames restored in the early part of the 20th century. So Juliette and John Kinzie build this house using, it's federal money from the agency, from the U.S. Indian Agency. But Fort Winnebago is I want to say it's not more than a couple miles. So it's a long walk, but it's a walk from there. And they lived much of the time at Fort Winnebago. And then Portage was, so the agency house was not with the military straight up. They tried to keep them separate so that the agent had a different function. That was diplomatic, not military. So they were trying to keep that separate with only some success over the course of time. But you can see they've got Fort Winnebago. Also, there's a historic site there too, up in Portage. So they build this house, and they're settling in to Indian country. So Juliette has made herself a Westerner. She's come west, and she's going to, again, on the basis of her experiences in Wisconsin, she's going to write this book, Waubun. But Waubun is not just her experiences in Wisconsin, but they also include her experiences in Chicago. So she finally comes to Chicago in 1831. 1831 is a tough year in Chicago. Her uncle has just died. There is cholera has been coming through, and her uncle and her niece and her nephew, well, it's not her niece and her nephew, her uncle's children have died. So her Ellen Kinzie, so her sister-in-law has survived, but the rest of the family has died. And her mother-in-law, Eleanor Kinzie, is going to come live with John and Juliette up in Portage. So they're kind of closing up the Kinzie operations in Chicago. And over the course of this really awful spring, I guess it was rainy and cold, and you couldn't do much in Chicago in this spring, and they were all mourning the death of her uncle. Her mother-in-law tells her all kinds of stories about early Chicago. And those chapters then in Waban are really our history of the War of 1812 and also early Chicago history. And it's the stories that her mother-in-law told her that she recounts here. And it makes her really arguably the very first historian of Chicago. And she first publishes this part of it in 1844 and then in 1856. Question? Okay, so Waban it's a Algonquian word for early day. So no, it's not. So the subtitle is the early day in the Northwest. So she's giving it away, but she doesn't say that's what it is. But that's what it is. So she's talking about the early days of the West, of the settlement of the West. I mean, one could look at this and say this isn't an early day. This is the final days for the indigenous people in these regions, but that's not, you get a sense then of how she reads this, how she sees this world as this is what's coming west for her. So this is a house that's familiar to those of you that know the Norwood Park story, the Nobles story, right? So the Noble family, this is the Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable house. So Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable builds this house in the 1790s, probably the early 1790s. And then this house is, he sells the house, not the land, because the land isn't for sale, but he sells the house and his improvements by 1800. And John Kinzie will acquire them. So there's a middleman there, but John Kinzie will acquire them, the senior John Kinzie, so Juliette's father-in-law. So this house had been the Kinzie mansion for decades across the early part of the 19th century when Fort Dearborn was directly across the street. So this mansion is basically at the northeast corner of the DuSable/Michigan Avenue Bridge. So where it's the big, the Apple. It's the Apple store, thank you. It is exactly the Apple store, and it was once called Pioneer Square or Pioneer Court, there we go. And now it's the Apple store, and there's a wonderful bust of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable there. There had been a monument for Kinzie talking about markers moving around. The marker had not been replaced on the Kinzie family for all of this. But then by 1831, the Kinzie family was living in the U.S. Agency House in Chicago, which is where Alexander Wolcott, he had built that house. It was called Cobweb Castle. Didn't give you really warm, fuzzy feelings about it, what it was like. But for many years, he was a bachelor. That was the only explanation that I could find for it. But so the Kinzie family were going to have to vacate the agency house because the agent had died, right? Because Wolcott had died. And so the whole family was moving up north with Eleanor, in particular Eleanor, to live with Juliette and John. In the course of that, then all know that the Nobles then were living in this house. And the overlap, there's quite likely that they encountered each other. There are hundreds of people living in Chicago at this point in time. But I have never seen that confirmation. But I would imagine that that's the case. Take a good look at Waban, if somebody does, maybe you can tease something out of what she says about Chicago in 1831 to get a better sense of that. Okay, so that house is our connection, I think, to the Norwood Park history that we've got. One of the things I find really interesting is she drew this. So I used this image for decades. And I pulled it out of A.T. Andreas, who is a 19th century historian who did beautiful, just did work that we still use all the time, but he included this in his book, and I've lifted it and used it in class and all kinds of things. And then to come and find and realize that she's the person, the original of this. She drew the original of this from the description that her mother-in-law gave her. Okay, and she did, again, I go back to, she's trained at this school with Emma Willard, who says, draw maps, write history. And she's been reading Henry Schoolcraft, and Henry Schoolcraft is, write about your travels. Well, she draws this map of Chicago, not when she was there, so she's writing as a historian, but to tell the Kinzie story. And it becomes a base story for telling the history, the early history of Chicago. Okay, so she gets to Chicago. She's in Chicago for just the spring of 1831, and then they go back to Portage. She has a child during the Black Hawk War, and cholera is back, so it's been for a number of seasons. Then cholera will come back, but cholera comes with the U.S. Army when they come in, when Winfield Scott comes in to fight again in the Black Hawk War against the Sauk, who are in revolt against U.S. policy. Juliette is up in Portage, in that house in Portage, which she has filled with things that she brought in. She just had, I think, a half dozen big crates that she brought with her. And one of the crates was a piano. And I love, this is up in Portage, Wisconsin still. Again, the colonial dames did the work on the house. This is not her, the actual piano that she had. That piano, I tracked that piano, and I could keep I knew she had that piano until 1868. And then she loses her house, and the piano, I think, goes into a sister-in-law's attic, and then it's going to burn in the fire. So in 1871. So I think the actual, back here in Chicago. But this piano is the same make and model. So it's coming from New York. They did a wonderful job in tracking down one. So the legs come off, and it fit into a crate. And this piano then is her bringing part of the Eastern. She's got a box of books. She's got the piano. She's coming west. And she sets herself up in Indian country in this way. And she's all set, I think, for a life ahead. And then the Black Hawk War, things are really changing, right? And we know this in 1830 in this area. We've got the Black Hawk War is going to be ending the Indian presence in this area. The Potawatomi and their allies are going to be forced to leave this area beginning in 1835-36. And the whole territory is really going to become open for real estate speculation, right? So what had been, even in 1831, when she first visits Chicago, a place that wasn't wasn't a real estate speculation, but was really still a settlement in Indian country, this trading outpost. Now, by 1834, so this is really in short order, her family, the Kinzie family, claims that whole piece. This is north of the Chicago River, where the Kinzie house had been. They're going to make a preemption claim on a large tract of land that they will then be able to subdivide and sell. And Juliette and John go to New York. They go back to New York because it's so important to them to try and make a lot of money to do this. And so they make a decision to leave Indian country. So they leave Portage, they come to Chicago, and then they go east to have this map put together. Joshua Hathaway actually draws the map, but the Kinzies put up the money for it. And they go to New York and work with a lithographer in New York who does this multicolor map, which is really kind of amazing. And then they leave surveys all over the place. In New York with speculators, in Philadelphia speculators, and they send it down to Washington, D.C. So they're amongst the group of people that boom Chicago as a real estate speculation back in the early 1830s. And I guess the nobles by this point, they've bought their land, right? It's all going on at the same time. So this is downtown land, and the nobles have come out here and are claiming land. And why it's all taking place at the same time is because this is when that transition from Indian country, from being held by the Potawatomi to being held by the US government and then by individuals, it's going to happen like within a period of 3 years in a lot of places. This is going to be happening. They make a lot of money. So the Kinzies go from being employed by the US government or traders on the side. The Kinzies make a great deal of money. And by 1838, they can afford to pay for a portrait painter to do this painting of Juliette and her daughter Nellie, Eleanor, named after her mother-in-law, but known as Nellie. This is an itinerant English painter by the name of F.W. Wilkins, who came through Chicago. And the contrast here with the woman who's on the cover of my book is pretty strong. I mean, she's quite pleased with herself and where she is. Again, this is in Chicago that had just come out of being a place in Indian country. They built a big house. So it's one of the first brick buildings in Chicago. So they build this big house that looks something like the house that she came from in Middletown, Connecticut. So she's going to build this big house north of the river, a little bit further north than where the Kinzie mansion had stood. This Kinzie house was it's Michigan and Hubbard, but now it's Illinois. I can never keep the names of the streets straight. Hang on, I want to make sure I give you the right street. Michigan and Cass, which is Illinois, and why can't I think of it? Wabash. There we go. Today. So a little bit north of Trump Tower. And actually, it's one of those places where you've got double-decker. It's a double-decker street, so it's tied into the Wacker Drive system, and it's really a hole right now where their house was. But it was on a quarter acre, and she had gardens. She and her husband raised all kinds of fruits, vegetables. They had their own cows and the whole shebang early on as they started. So they're going to help build a neighborhood on the north side on the near north side of Chicago. So where the black area gives you a sense of where their house is. Across the street, they pay for one of the first churches in Chicago. So the brick, again, built with the same brick that their house was built in on land that the Kinzie family donates, is the St. James Episcopal Church. So it's one of the first churches we've got. And St. James will be moving. So St. James today has moved a little bit further north. So this neighborhood where they start is not where they're going to land and stay then from the 1855 or 1857 is when they moved north. So they're, at any rate, she's helping to build this church. They build a hotel. It's called the Lake House, which is just to the east of their house, again in that brick. It's one of the biggest, fanciest hotels. They think this is 1839, 1840, they think they've really made it. And what's happening at the very same time, though, is the panic of 1837, the depression of 1837, everything really starts to just go south. And real estate values drop precipitously, and the Kinzies never recover. So they have this 3 or 4 years of being really wealthy people in Chicago. And then they lose all their money that they've made, and John Kinzie is going to become basically a civil servant. So he'd been a civil servant as a U.S. Indian agent. He's going to go back and he's going to work for the canal. He's going to work for tax offices. He's going to take all kinds of appointments over the course of the next 20 years, and then he's going to work for the U.S. Army during the Civil War. But you get some sense of, so their family will remain in that house. They're going to be in a prominent early family, but they are not going to be. What happens here is very quickly in the late 1840s and into the 1850s, and here you can see the Kinzie house. This is a map from 1857, the Palminteri map. If you're interested in this, it's an enormous map. You can see it at the History Museum or at the Newberry. They've got copies of it, but it's been scanned. So if you just Google 1857 Palminteri map, you'll get this map and you can zoom in. And the amazing thing is that the artist the cartographer who did such a fine job that you can identify the church that they helped to build, the Kinzie house. The lake house is down below here, is right here. So you get a sense of that. But this is by 1857, the area is built up. And what's going on as Chicago is industrializing. So this is a place that had been Indian country. Now, very quickly after 1848, it's going to grow. And so the railroad comes in, the canal opens. The first railroad line is going to come in. You can see that's the circle up on the left there. Chicago will grow as a place where grain is going to be traded and shipped out. So grain elevators are going to line the banks of the river, and the grain elevators are the tallest buildings in town. I mean, they're just enormous. Somebody's written about them being Chicago's first skyscrapers, and I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about them. So you've got the railroads. You've got the grain elevators. Cyrus McCormick comes to Chicago in 1848, and he starts a factory that's going to become International Harvester many iterations later. But the McCormick Company here in the Reaper, right? So they're going to make agricultural implements. Their big factory is right here. So they're going to put in a big factory there. Just across the river, the Illinois Central is going to build an enormous, all their yards, and the railroad, the end point for the railroad that's going to run all the way to New Orleans across the 1850s. So Juliette is sitting here in a place that just is transformed around her. And their house, they still own this property in the immediate area, but around them, a lot of smaller houses are built. Their wealthy neighbors that had once lived very close to them are going to move further north. And eventually in 1857, St. James will move further north as well. And they're just wealthy neighbors. Cyrus McCormick becomes one of the wealthiest people. I mean, they're amongst the wealthiest people in the world. Bertha and Potter Palmer, the Newberrys. These are people who have immense wealth by the late 1850s, and many of them are in the same congregation, not all of them, but some of them, the Ogdens, the Newberrys are in the same congregation. Let's see, so there's a bigger picture of that palmatory map, which is great fun. It does not run out to Norwood Park, I can tell you that. So that's unfortunate, but it really is just but you do get a sense of the built up area that's operating here. Okay, so Juliette, they don't have the money that other people are making, but she has decided in the 1850s that she can make her mark as being one of the first families in Chicago history, and she's going to write this story, and she figures out ways of planting herself in that story. We have lost much of that, but she really felt that she could plant she and her husband and her in-laws into this story. So she does this painting has a painting done of herself. She has her husband, a small one of her husband, a small one of herself. These were very expensive paintings, so that she went and priced out how she could have just a small one done of herself. Then they spent a lot of money on her daughter. So this is Nellie, who is in the portrait in 1838. Nellie is in a yellow silk. This is actually a copy of the original. The original is still in the Kinzie family. So this is this building. Okay, so let me tell you what happens here. Juliette's daughter, Nellie, is sent off to finishing school in New York. So they have enough money and connections to have her go back to very close to where she was in Connecticut, but she's in New York City. And she meets a Southerner by the name of William Gordon, who's going to Yale at this time for his undergraduate. And so he's come from Savannah. His mother actually moves with him from Savannah and lives with him in New Haven while he's going to college. So it's one of those, you're just kind of like, okay, the world is a different place. So at any rate, she and Nellie and Willie, decide that they fall in love and they want to get married. And this is 1853. He graduates from school. They're going to go back to He wants to go back to Savannah. She wants to stay in Chicago. They're trying to find work for William in Chicago. There's all kinds of things booming in Chicago. They're like, we'll find you a job at a bank, at the Board of Trade. They have all kinds of connections, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And one of the reasons, and they have a big part of this fight is on politics. So one of the things that we can say about the Kinzie family is John Kinzie is a staunch Whig, and he's going to have worked as a Whig across the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. His appointments were often in Whig administrations, so he got rewarded in that way for it. But they were just very committed to being Whigs. When the Republican Party is organized, and I say we because Juliette really saw herself as a part of this. It was a unit. She and her husband were working in politics. And I think Mary and Abraham Lincoln, to some degree, had a similar kind of thing, but nothing to the degree that Juliette laid claim to politics in this way. And her daughter Nellie also was intensely interested in politics. So they helped to organize the Republican Party in Illinois in 1855, 1856. So while this courtship is going on between this Southerner who's a Democrat, who has enslaved people in his household, so he's a cotton factor in Savannah, and Juliette's family is here. They're not abolitionists, but they're anti-slavery. And the difference, the thing that's really interesting is, to me at any rate, is that Willie, the future son-in-law, says no one will come to Chicago because it's a hotbed of Republican radicalism and abolitionism, and we just don't want to have anything to do with Chicago. So there's this fighting back and forth about what they're going to do. I mean, the letters are awful. They break up, they get back together again. And at any rate, the end result of all of this is 1857. They get married in December of 1857, just before the church moves further north. So they get married in the church across the street from Juliette, and they move to Savannah. And Nellie then adopts being a Southerner, while her mother becomes a Northerner at this point. But her daughter then convinces, she gets the religion. So her husband had been Methodist, and they join the Episcopal Church. So they become Episcopals in Savannah. None of Willie's family came to the wedding. He came alone, which was just something that just didn't happen after such a long courtship. But Nellie then and Juliette will start this series of letters that they're going to write 2, 3, 4 times a week for the rest of their lives. So for the next 15 years, really. So until Juliette's death in 1870, they're going to write back and forth. How do we have all of this? So this room is in Savannah. You can walk into it. This is a photograph that I took, I guess not very well, but it gives you a sense of what's going on. This is the birthplace of Juliette Gordon Low. Can you make a connect? Anybody here? If I got a Girl Scout in the room? Yeah, okay. So the connection here is Juliette Gordon Low is the granddaughter of Juliette Kinzie. And so the reason that we have this portrait, we have this house that they have, let's see if I don't know the picture of the house, but we'll go back to it. The picture of the house, the big house in Savannah, is because of the granddaughter, Juliette, who is named after her grandmother, Juliette. So it's Juliette Gordon Low, and she's called, Daisies and Blossoms. Daisy is one of the groups in Girl Scouts, and she was called Daisy by her grandparents. So there's a really fun little connection there. Okay, so then we get the war, right? So they're writing back and forth, they're seeing each other. Nellie has 2 kids. The war itself then creates Juliette as a Northerner, and by the 1860s then she is dealing with the war itself. She's continuing to write letters. She figures out all kinds of ways to write letters. So I don't know, if at first inaugural, Abraham Lincoln says, when the war is just about to start, I'm going to make sure the mails get through, that letters will get through to Southerners, that we're not going to break that tie. And he wasn't able to fulfill that, but you get a sense of what he was trying to do there, was that kind of binds the country together, is that you could get letters. But Juliette then will spend much of her time figuring out how to get letters to her daughter. So she knows people all over the country, and she'll send letters to Kentucky and ask someone in Kentucky who knows someone who's traveling to Tennessee that will take it to Tennessee, that will then put that in a post box that in fact will be recognized by the Confederacy, and it will get delivered. Or she'll send letters to POWs, that is Confederate POWs that she knows in U.S. Confederate prisoner of war camps. She will send them to them and ask them to put them in the packets that they get to send letters to their family members in the South. So she sends letters to Canada, and from Canada, they would get forwarded down to Savannah. She sent letters, Havana, she's got family in Havana, so letters got sent to Havana. And by 1861, 62, there are British publishers that are interested in her book, Wabun. And so she's sending things to her British publisher and asking them to send letters to her daughter in Savannah. So on top of that, it's not surprising that she will write to Abraham Lincoln, who she knew. I mean, when Abraham Lincoln is elected president, or becomes president-elect in November of 1860, he comes to Chicago. And they've known each other now from Whig politics and Republican politics. And she describes him as the father of the country, but she's the grandmother of Chicago. So she pitches that to Abraham Lincoln. So he smiles and they have a conversation about the way the world has changed. She writes to Abraham Lincoln November 16th, 1863, asking, because you have to get special permission from the president to send things into the South across enemy lines. And she wants boxes of stuff to go to her granddaughters. And by this point, she has a grandson as well. And my daughter, Nellie, who unhappily for her and us is down in Dixie, left there by an obstinate rebel fool of a husband. So you get some sense of how she was. Again, she describes her daughter as very loyal, even though her husband is not loyal. Her husband's in the Georgia Hussar. So, this is November 16th. I don't know if November 19th, 1863 is the Gettysburg Address. So this is days before the Gettysburg Address. It's sitting on his desk at the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln's answering this. Lincoln answers this letter. It's in the Library of Congress, in fact, because it's kind of fun that these letters then will pop up in places. And they send these trunks through. So her granddaughters get shoes and clothes and tea and other things that are hidden all over in these boxes that get sent down. So she really works hard during the war years to get this back and forth with her daughter. It's not all great, but what it did for me is it really reminded me how much this is a family fight that she knows. Her son-in-law is fighting against her sons. Her oldest son, it's a second son, enlists the first day after Fort Sumter when they call for troops in 1861, and he goes into an Illinois unit that ships out from Southern Illinois, and then he's going to be assigned to work with his uncle, David Hunter, who's going to be a general in the East. He's going to maneuver through the war, but his older brother, who stays out of the initial round of volunteering, will volunteer in the second year of the war. So Juliette has 4 adult children at this point. Well, 4 children, 3 adults and 1 still in high school. And the daughter is in Savannah, and one of the sons then enlists right away. The second son enlists in 1862. He's a steamboat expert. He'd been working on building steam engines for railroads and steam engines for ships, and he's blown up at Mountain City in 1862. So he's severely injured and dies from the wounds of the steam engine blowing up there after it had been hit by a bomb. The third son, who was in high school, at the start of the war, enlists by the end of the war without much permission from his parents, but he's going to do it anyways. So they agree that he can go be a guard, and he actually gets captured as a POW. So all three of her sons then have endured quite a bit during these years. Her husband, John, goes off to fight, serves in the Army, in the bursar's office, and she's home alone during the war. When the war ends, her husband comes home. They get her daughter out of Savannah fairly early. Her husband is still fighting with the Confederacy in the spring of 1865. But William Tecumseh Sherman, who comes through Savannah in December of 1864, is entertained in Nellie's living room because, of course, Juliette knows that William Tecumseh Sherman and is able to make a connection and says, you gotta go see my daughter. So William Tecumseh Sherman then agrees that he will help her get out. So Nellie gets out with her cotton. So she has bales of cotton which make it to New York, and they use that as a basis for recouping their fortune after the war is over. That is her husband, the Confederate William, who comes back to Chicago in 1865 and gets a loan just after his father-in-law's funeral. So Juliette, I'm gonna close up. Juliette's final years from 1865 to 1870 were spent as a widow. She had a very hard time as a widow. It's another whole really interesting story I'm happy to talk about. I'm fascinated by the way that women who are widowed during these years, what a tough time they're having, because the laws are changing about how women are being treated when they're widowed and what kind of protections they have. Juliette wanted a lot of protections, and women who were in favor of more equal rights wanted women to have more equal rights with men, and she got caught. And so, in fact, she had to sell her house, the house that she lived in for 30 years, and she lives out the last of her days in rented apartments. She dies near where she was born in Middleton, Connecticut. She dies on Long Island in September of 1870, just before, again, the year before the Chicago fire. She's put everything that she had in Chicago in storage, and she's gone and she's staying with her. She's spending the time on Long Island at the beach with her daughter, who was just about to have a fourth child. So she was there with the 3 grandchildren and the fourth on the way. And she takes morphine by mistake. She's given a morphine overdose. Instead of quinine, she's given morphine, and she dies within 24 hours after she'd taken this lethal dose of morphine. So she's buried then she's buried at Graceland Cemetery with a book. So her daughter Nellie, there were no grave markers here. There was really not much money in 1870 when Juliette dies, but they'd had the grave site went back to before the Civil War, when her husband actually had helped to organize Graceland Cemetery. And but Nellie puts this the book on her stone when they recoup their fortune after the war down in Savannah. I'll stop there. Happy to chat more about it. I find a really interesting figure. I've learned a great deal by spending time with her, and I think you might too. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure, of course.
Wait, where is Portage?
So Portage is, it's in Wisconsin. It's about, it's within a half an hour of Madison. So it's just north of Madison, middle of the state.
Right over there.
Yeah, and so it's east from Green Bay. West from Green Bay. Green Bay is east of Portage.
Madison, we know where Madison is.
Yeah, so it's just up the interstate from Madison.
Okay, good. Worth a trip.
It's a wonderful trip.
Any other questions? And people on Zoom, I did open up the Zoom volume.
Sure.
Do you know if they had pensions for widows during the Civil War, such as her husband died?
There are going to be some pensions. There will be, because actually some of the the pension records are really a rich source for historians to find out all kinds of things about the ways in which the world operated. But those pensions it's going to be state to state, because in large measure it's all run through the state. She has very little. So when her husband dies, we're in a world where people borrow money all the time. So they've got these lines of credit all over the place. Sound familiar? But if a husband dies, the credit stops. And everything is frozen, and all of the creditors come forward to collect their debts before anything it goes back to the wife. Now, the thing that drove a lot of people, thinking about the thing is that if the reverse is not the case, so wife dies, doesn't make any difference. There's not an end to the credit lines and the whole thing. And arguably, we don't finish that story it's not arguably, we don't finish the story of making that equal to 74, 75, 1974, 75, not 1874 or 75. I can remember when the stories of my mother-in-law when she was widowed, went in to get a credit card and couldn't get a credit card and she couldn't even pay bills very easily because she didn't have any credit. This is 73, 74, and it's a process that got better even by 1874, 1875, but it was not, that kind of inequality really was a big part of this story. So I think that's there was some money, and they had the house, and they were going to shield the house for a period of time, but what happened, but it doesn't, and things are being sold off the side of the courthouse. So this is very public, and people know that you're a widow, and know that you have to raise money and sell these assets to pay off debts. She gets so angry, and her anger you see it in Mary Lincoln too. There's an anger there, and I think it's rooted. These women are also angry about lots of things that happened during the war to them, but I think there's also a real anger there about how widows are being treated. It isn't interesting. It was not what I'd intended to fall into.
George Custer's wife also, I can't remember her name.
It's a period of history that I personally was not aware of.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know much about it either before I got started.
Really. Any other questions?
She went. Oh, that was Custer's widow writes a book, right?
Yeah, she writes to Grant.
Right, and right. So sorry, but that So at any rate, the widow story is they're interesting parts of it.
It is very interesting. A whole nother book.
Maybe. Yeah.
Did Abraham Lincoln respond to Juliette Kinzie or any one of her letters?
Oh yeah, and in fact, she does this multiple times, and he replies, and he gives his permission. She gets to do this. She gets special permission. And in fact, there's a letter on his desk when he's assassinated, not from Juliette, but from her husband John before he dies, in asking whether or not they can release the bales of cotton that Sherman had got to New York, but they couldn't get released from the, they're being held at the wharf, and they needed special permission Thank goodness. I mean, it's like you don't want to see this everything all start up again. But they got the permission, even though it was as Lincoln had been assassinated. So they're a known family. That's one of the other things here is that they were tied in with the Army because of the business with the U.S. agent, even though they're separate. The Army is small. So when Juliette is up in Portage, so's Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis is leaving, and he's built all this furniture, and they kind of inherit all of this awful big lug pieces of furniture. So they have all of these little family jokes about Jefferson Davis that they've got going before the Civil War because he was, but they know him. They know most of the Army is small. I guess that was and so many people, the regular Army is small. People know each other. So they know whether they go with the Confederacy or they stay in the US. I think that's, it was something that I did not think about, that just how much people knew each other. And that this was so personal in that way. Yeah. And Lincoln definitely knows them.
Any other questions? If anybody's on Zoom and has a question, you have to unmute. Going once? All right. Thank you, Anna.
It's my pleasure.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.